Thank you very much, Rajul. I'd like to thank you and Regina for giving me this chance to come back to IFPRI and to debut some of the themes in the new book that I've just published entitled Food Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know. I say a new book. It was technically published yesterday, so it couldn't be too much newer than that. I think Rajul panicked when she saw the table of contents for the book that I've photocopied and made available here, because she wondered if I was going to be able to cover all of that material in a simple 30-minute presentation. I'm not going to try to do that. The table of contents is extensive. When Oxford University Press asked me to write the book, they said, "We want you to cover everything." Everything from the food crisis to food subsidies, everything from agroecology to agribusiness, everything from slow food to fast food, everything from famine to obesity. And they said, "And we want you to speak truth to power." And I said, well, it's even dangerous to speak truth about power when you're dealing with food politics, but I gave it my best. In today's talk, I'll limit myself to looking at just three of the themes that emerge in this book. First is a theme that in today's industrial and post-industrial societies, North America, Europe, Japan, farm lobby power is surprisingly undiminished. Farm lobby power over tax policies inside the agricultural sector, over environmental policies inside the agricultural sector, certainly over income subsidies inside the agricultural sector. Power in these areas has not been significantly weakened. For example, look at the outcome of the 2008 Farm Bill here in the United States. It was written at a time when farmers should not have had a huge claim on further subsidies from the government. In 2008, net farm income was actually 40% above the average of the previous 10 years. And yet, the farm lobby was able to push through the Congress a new $286 billion farm bill that even included a new safety net program, the so-called ACRE program. And they managed to pass this bill over a rare presidential veto by wide margins. It passed the House by a margin of 3-1. It passed the Senate by a margin of 6-1. It wasn't even close. Or look at the 2009 Waxman-Markey cap-and-trade bill that passed the House last spring. By the time the farm lobby got done with this bill, the agricultural sector had emerged as a completely uncapped sector. In fact, farmers would be given an opportunity to make money from the bill because they could sell offsets to the other sectors of the economy that were under a greenhouse gas emissions cap. Now, this durable power of farm lobbies to remain politically dominant within their own sector it's a noteworthy feature of contemporary food politics, because few would have expected it 20 years ago. Market-oriented economists, most of whom despise these subsidies, have, in acts of wishful thinking for decades now, forecast the demise of the farm lobby. It seems like every farm bill that passes is branded by someone as the last farm bill. I've collected predictions of the demise of the farm lobby for my personal amusement. The earliest one that I found actually goes back to the 1950s, and it was authored by a prominent agricultural economist at that time, John Kenneth Galbraith. He said, demographically, there just aren't going to be enough farmers around soon to support this kind of rent-seeking behavior. There was an important econometric study done in 1987, the Hanma and Hayami study, that projected that once the share of the population employed on farms fell below 5%, industrial societies would stop increasing the subsidies they gave to farmers and start cutting back on those subsidies. Well, the share of the French workforce still on farms fell below 5% 15 years ago. In Germany, the share of the workforce on farms is now at 3%. In the United States, it's less than 2%, and yet the subsidies remain intact. Trying to eliminate them through trade negotiations hasn't worked either. When we linked the outcome of the Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations to a reduction of farm subsidies, all we did was kill the Doha round. We didn't kill any farm subsidies. In trade negotiations, farm lobbies are so powerful that the agricultural tail always ends up wagging the manufacturing trade and services trade dog. Now, in my book, I explain the surprising durability of farm lobby power, mostly through reference to entrenched institutions and established processes. In the United States, as long as there are standing committees on agriculture in both the House and the Senate, and as long as there is permanent legislation in the background, there will always be a farm bill renewal process, and there will always be a new farm bill. If we were starting from scratch with the farm population less than 2% of the workforce and agriculture less than 2% of GDP, we wouldn't create separate standing committees on agriculture in the House and the Senate. We wouldn't have a cabinet-level Department of Agriculture. But these vestigial institutions from a time when the sector was more significant politically are still in control of the process, and they generate a replication of the output. Likewise, inside the European Union, as long as there's a separate Council of Agricultural Ministers, there will be a generous common agricultural policy. So that's my first theme. The second theme about the politics of food and farming in the 20th century that emerges from my book is something else that wouldn't have quite been expected if you'd been writing 20 or 30 years ago, and that's the crisis of obesity in wealthy post-industrial societies. This has influenced food politics in rich countries in surprising ways. It's influenced food politics much more than it has influenced actual food policy. In the 20th century, it was conventional, at least among most economists, to assume that food consumers wanted three things. They wanted food that would be safe, food that would be inexpensive, and food that would be convenient to purchase and to consume. What has emerged in the 21st century in the industrial world, triggered in part by the obesity crisis, is a more vocal and visible second category of citizens, a category of elite food consumers and food writers and food activists who frankly don't want food to be inexpensive or convenient. This elite cohort of consumers, they often refer to themselves as foodies, has actually declared a culture war on the food industries and the industrial farming systems that have been dedicated to giving us a safe, cheap, convenient food supply over the last 50 or 100 years. The new foodie culture, which is surprisingly dominant, at least in my social and professional circles, they don't want food to be safe, cheap, and fast. They want food to be organic, local, and slow. The hegemony of this view is of interest to me. As Rajul said, I'm at Wellesley College and Harvard University. I went to a meeting at Harvard University a year and a half ago, hosted by the president of the university, Drew Faust. It was a meeting on sustainable food. It was a university-wide meeting on sustainable food. Now, who did they bring to address this important topic? It fascinated me that there weren't any economists, there weren't any agricultural scientists, there weren't any nutritionists, there weren't even any ecologists, or even any historians. President Faust is an historian. Instead, they had a panel of four people. One was a noted humanities scholar. The second was a celebrity restaurateur from Oakland, California. The third was a playwright from New York who had previously worked with the celebrity restaurateur. And the fourth was the head of the slow food movement in the United States, who was a recent Harvard College graduate. This panel was in unanimous agreement in its condemnation of food systems that have evolved around goals of safety without regard to nutrition, affordability without regard to quality, and convenience without regard to risks of overindulgence. This is now, Harvard Yard is now fertilized organically, and they have signs bragging of that fact. And Harvard's not in the lead. Harvard actually is playing catch-up to Yale University, which was far out ahead in promoting this new 20th century version, 21st century vision of sustainable food. But what will be the policy consequences of this new cultural challenge to conventional food and farming from the elite countercultural insurgency? In the industrial world, given the entrenched political power of the conventional farm lobby and the conventional food industry, there's not likely to be much policy change at all. The insurgents will eventually get their own light items in the budget. They already have. This will lead us into a new era that David Orden, who's here at IFPRI, once perceptively described as multi-agriculturalism. Everyone gets a subsidy. But the new elite push for organic, local, and slow food is going to be self-marginalizing in industrial countries for several reasons. First, the scientific consensus among toxicologists, nutritionists, and physicians that organic foods are safer or more nutritious than conventionally grown foods, there is no consensus on that. Most professional nutritionists, physicians, and toxicologists say that organic foods are not any safer, they're not any more nutritious than conventionally grown foods. Nor, if scaled up, would organic farming be environmentally sustainable. My book provides some fairly gloomy projections of the land area that would have to be devoted to grazing animals if America's food supply were to be grown organically. Nor does local food grown within a 100-mile radius have a smaller carbon footprint if it's hauled around in small pickup trucks than internationally traded food if it moves around in bulk in barges or by rail or by ocean freight. So the scientific foundation supporting this new set of preferences is at best fragile. Also, the push for organic has already been commercially co-opted by conventional industrial operations. In the United States, most organic milk today is factory farmed. In fact, the Cornucopia Institute, which promotes organic, is now campaigning against the sale of organic milk because they call it factory milk. But if you create a price premium for anything, it's only a matter of time before industrial scale operations move in. Also, most organic sales are now made through corporate supermarkets or even Walmart, not through community farm support systems. Also, and this is important, the social panic over the obesity crisis, which has helped fuel this interest in new ways of eating, just doesn't extend very far beyond cultural elites. Most of the actual victims of the obesity crisis are not elites, and they are remarkably unconcerned about their weight. 50% of those in America who are obese today say that their weight is not an issue. 40% of parents with obese children say that their child's weight is about right. So there isn't much room for elected politicians to run with this issue beyond exhortation and voluntarism. This is one reason why First Lady Michelle Obama's new initiative focuses only on childhood obesity. If you shame children, they can't vote against you. It's unlikely that politicians will do more than spend money to try to improve nutrition. They won't engage all of the taxing and regulatory instruments of governmental power to tell Americans how they should eat. It's not a winner politically. So that's my second theme. A third theme, it's when I turn to the new politics of food and farming in developing countries in the 21st century that I find some of the most unbalanced outcomes. What I find, in effect, is that both the mainstream supermarket and fast food culture and the new organic, local, and slow counterculture of the rich countries, both are now being exported inappropriately into the food and farming systems of the developing world. My book details the spread of industrial country fast food and supermarket chains into the developing world, helping now to promote in some of these developing countries an obesity crisis that will soon rival our own. The average Brazilian now consumes 392 pounds of packaged foods a year. That's almost half as much as we consume here in the United States, and obesity in Brazil has tripled in the last decade. The average Mexican now consumes 703 pounds of packaged foods a year. That's roughly equivalent to consumption in the United States. And obesity in Mexico is an acute health crisis. 3 out of 10 pesos spent on food in Mexico are now spent at Walmart. Food purchasing and consumption habits that we have innovated here in rich countries are being disseminated through foreign direct investment into poor countries. China also is catching up with the West in the obesity race. And fast food and packaged food is a part of the problem in urban China as well. Just last month, McDonald's announced plans to double its presence in China from 1,000 retail outlets up to 2,000 retail outlets by 2013. They also plan to open a branch of Hamburger University in Shanghai, which interests me. I guess you can take courses at Hamburger University that transfer to other universities, so it is an accredited institution. And yet note the extension of Western-style eating preferences into countries that are not yet post-industrial. China's leaders have been surprisingly unconcerned with this foreign assault on their traditional cuisine. McDonald's has done an extremely good job of marketing itself in China. In fact, surveys reveal that most Chinese customers, most children in China believe that Ronald McDonald is Chinese and lives in Beijing. So the unhealthy eating habits of the rich countries are being spread through foreign direct investment into the food economies of the countries that are not yet rich. But at the same time, the elite foodie counterculture of rich countries is also being exported to the poor. The countercultural opponents of high productivity farming, industrial scale farming, are not exercising much influence over the agricultural policies of Europe or North America or Japan, where conventional farming is mature and where farm lobbies are powerful, but they have, through vigorous transnational advocacy efforts, been able to influence the politics of food and farming in countries where the agricultural sector isn't yet mature and where farm lobbies are not yet strong. Both inside and outside of the United Nations system, transnational advocacy NGOs pushing for social justice, pushing for environmental protection, have embraced the countercultural argument about agriculture, the view that the original Green Revolution was not an achievement. It generated so many unintended consequences that it was, in fact, a mistake. NGOs refer to it as a tragedy. And these advocacy organizations, like Friends of the Earth International or Greenpeace International or La Via Campesina or Food First, these organizations which are speak for the poor, but they're headquartered in places like Amsterdam or Brussels or Oakland, California. They're now working to persuade policy leaders in the developing world to embrace a model of farming based on organic production, traditional knowledge, and what's called food sovereignty, which is significant disconnection from international markets. Now, in my own view, there's something seriously inappropriate about Europeans and North Americans telling political leaders in Africa that their food and farming systems should be organic, local, and slow. After all, when you think about it, most food and farming systems in Africa today are already organic, local, and slow. They're de facto organic because most smallholder farmers in Africa use no synthetic fertilizers, no synthetic pesticides. Synthetic fertilizer use in Africa is on average 9 kilograms per hectare, and most poor small farmers don't use any at all. They're de facto organic. Of necessity, food systems in Africa are local because transportation costs are so high. Transport costs are high because the road system is so poorly developed. 70% of all farmers living in rural Africa are at least a 30-minute walk, at least 2 kilometers from the nearest all-weather road. So most household travel is still on foot. Most household transport consists of carrying things. That drives up transport costs and disconnects these rural areas from more than local markets most of the time. And food in Africa is certainly slow. Ask the women in Africa who prepare the meals. First, they have to, first they plant the maize, and then they weed the maize, and then they harvest the maize, and then they store the maize, and then they strip the maize, and then they shell the maize, and then they dry the maize, and then they winnow the maize, and then they pound the maize, and then they soak it again, and then they dry it again, and then they go to fetch wood and water, and they build a fire and boil the water and cook the maize. That's a slow food system. But it's not something that we should be wishing on anybody. Working within this organic, local, and slow food and farming system, most Africans in the countryside today have crop yields that are only about 1/10 as high as farmers in North America or Europe. Their income is only about $1 a day, and they stand a 1 in 3 chance of being undernourished. Nonetheless, the countercultural advocacy against Green Revolution farming has influence in these poor countries. For example, it was the countercultural argument that dominated the final content of the 2008 IAASTD report, the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development, which emerged from a 4-year exercise sponsored by the UN system and the World Bank. Instead of endorsing productivity as the lead goal for agricultural science and technology in poor countries, this report, I think tellingly, identified the multifunctionality of farming as the goal. Now, multifunctionality is a concept that originally emerged in Europe because agriculture was producing too much food. So they had to come up with some other justification for the subsidies. To transplant such a concept into the food politics of societies where the agricultural sector is producing too little food strikes me as inappropriate. But inside the echo chamber of the UN system, including now even the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, this 2008 assessment is now invoked as a reason to call into question the so-called failed Green Revolution model of agricultural productivity enhancement. And this countercultural advocacy against the Green Revolution has also had a serious impact on levels of donor assistance to agricultural modernization and agricultural research in developing countries. Africa's hunger crisis has been increasing rather steadily over the last 3 decades, but as elite opinion in the United States has turned away from support for agricultural modernization, U.S. official development assistance to agriculture in Africa declined by 85%. In recent years, the U.S. government has implicitly adopted a food aid forever strategy for addressing hunger in Africa. In recent years, the United States has spent between 10 and 20 times as much delivering food to Africa as it spends investing in agricultural productivity in Africa. So to summarize my summary, in the three areas that I've touched on here, the new politics of food and farming is not well aligned with contemporary social needs. In today's industrial and post-industrial countries, where the number one problem is no longer hunger but obesity, power is still in the food and farming sector. It's squarely in the hands of agricultural producers and food industries that don't have an especially high motivation to address the obesity crisis. And the minority of citizens in these rich countries who do want to address the obesity crisis are culturally out of touch with their less elite fellow citizens who are the victims of that crisis. This cohort of elites has embraced a self-marginalizing countercultural vision of somehow returning to a pre-industrial food system that's organic, local, and slow. And finally, and I think most dangerous, the one place that these elites have had the greatest policy influence is in the pre-industrial countries where food systems are already organic, local, and slow. The unhelpful advice to Africa's farmers from the rich country elites seems to be, it's okay, you should stay that way. Don't make the mistakes we made. Even though the implication is that they will also remain essentially low productivity farmers, which means they'll also be poor, which means they'll also be vulnerable to chronic undernutrition.